Okay, Jia, Assalamu alaikum. This lecture is about paradigms and research approaches. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the different paradigms that are available to us as social scientists from the perspective of Burrell and Morgan's book and the dichotomy or the framework that they have presented. So I'll be giving you the names of the different paradigms and then I'll be discussing them briefly, and this will enable you to choose the right paradigm for your research study so that you can move forward with your own research, right? So the objectives of this lecture are very briefly to examine the philosophical assumptions that underlie some of the popular methodologies that exist and how they can influence us directly or indirectly in our own research. So I'll be discussing some of these different paradigms, or you can call them methodologies per se, and I'll be giving you some of the fundamentals of those without getting into much details, and I'll leave it up to you to then choose the relevant paradigm for your own research. And as I stated a little bit ago, we'll be looking at it from a map that is present in sociological paradigms and organizational analysis, which is a book that was written by Burrell and Morgan in 1979. And it's quite an influential book, even though it's quite dated, but no new versions of it came out. And this book discussed pretty much the paradigms that exist for the social sciences and how they govern the research that we can conduct, right? So in Burrell and Morgan's book, there's a mention of four different traditions of doing research, and we've looked at these to some extent already. And these traditions include functionalism, interpretivism, radical structuralism, and radical humanism. So the traditions that exist, they have their own ontological viewpoints and their own epistemological underpinnings behind them. And based upon which tradition that we follow, the way that we pose our research questions is going to be quite different. And the way that we're going to approach the data available to us, that is the fieldwork or the empirical data that we're trying to gather, is going to be different. And how we interpret that data is going to be governed by the particular tradition that we're following. And the outcomes of our analysis are also going to be different. Number one, because of the nature of the research questions, and also because the paradigm is going to govern the nature of the questions being asked and the nature of the interpretation that can be provided. So, for example, if you're interested in checking out the frequencies of the occurrence of something, or if you're concerned about correlating two variables together, or if you're trying to see the relationship among certain things, then you belong to a particular tradition, and we can say that you follow functionalism or positivism per se. And in that case, you're going to be looking at the data in a very peculiar way, and your analysis is going to concentrate upon showing the strength of that relationship or the intensity of the correlation that exists, right? On the other hand, of the spectrum, we've got interpretivism, where we're looking at the experiences of people, and we're trying to capture the greater understanding that exists amongst the people that sort of give rise to that data, and we try to provide an interpretation of what is going on, right? And we can do this either blindly, so to speak, in the sense that we don't have a sort of go in a manner which is, we can say that we have no a priori assumptions, which is difficult to do. We always have some priori assumptions, so we can have a more structured method, so to speak, and then we can collect the data, analyze it, and see where it fits with the given structures that we have identified, and what new exists in the data set. And if we find something new, we bring that to the foreground, and that helps us to contribute towards the theory that we are using, right? Then we've got this idea of structuralism, which is that there are structures that exist. Now, that's a different type of a question to ask, which is that, are these structures existing before, or are these structures existing after? It's sort of like a chicken and egg type of a problem, right? So if the structure exists beforehand, so then what consequence does it have upon the participants, right? Or is it the inverse, which is that the experiences of these participations give rise to certain structures, and then these structures inhibit the way that we can function, and they bound our rationality and our decision making, so to speak, right? So radical structuralism is mostly concerned about the effects of structures upon our thought processes and how we can sort of understand the role of these structures upon the way that we conduct business and upon the way that we exercise our relationships with others, right? And then we've got humanism, which is concerned about the experiences of people solely, and how they relate to each other, and how through those relationships they understand the experiences that they're having, right? So these are different traditions that exist, and they govern the way that we can conduct research. Now, Burrell and Morgan go on to argue that these paradigms are incompatible with each other, right? For example, if you belong to functionalism, then functionalism is not compatible with interpretivism. If you belong to interpretivism, that is incompatible with structuralism or humanism per se. And the reason being is that the assumptions underpinning these traditions are different, right? They've got different ontologies, they've got different epistemologies, which makes these as renders them incompatible with each other, which is not a problem because mostly researchers belong to one particular paradigm, and that is perfectly fine. And accepting an ontology and its underpinning epistemology shapes the way that you are going to conduct your research. So belonging to one tradition is not a problem, but having your feet in two traditions is going to create some issues for you, right? Now, what kind of example can we come about or come up with regarding the incompatibility is that, for example, the assumption that institutions and organizations, in order to regulate human behavior, do not compare well with the view that society and organizations are fundamentally designed to maintain or increase inequality. Right. So on the one side, the argument says that these structures exist to help us function, to help us to understand, and to go on to develop great things. But on the other side, there's this view that these structures are actually ways or mechanisms to hinder us, to create inequality, and to create discontent, and so forth. So we can see that the mindset that we adopt is going to have an effect upon our research, and also there's going to be incompatibility. So if we are concerned about it in one way, we may be concerned simply about discovering these structures and how they are. And if we're concerned in another way, we could be concerned about how these structures have an effect upon us, right? So that's the idea. Now, we've talked a little bit so far about epistemology, so we're not going to engage in epistemological debates any further. Rather, we're going to concentrate upon this idea of researcher engagement. Right? So there's two contrasting views on the relationships that exist between the researchers and the objects of the research. Right? One view is that researchers should strive to be independent and detached from the people and processes that they are studying. So in that way, we have this duality, so to speak. We're saying that the researcher is separate from that which is being researched. But on the other side, we've got views where people have opinionated that there's this lack of separation between the researcher and what is being researched, and it's an engaged view, right, rather than a disengaged view, which is to state that the researcher is not separate from what is being researched. So if you're looking at certain processes, you can't look at those processes in a detached manner. You are a part of that process. If you're looking at certain people, then you can't detach yourself from those people, because you are more than likely a part of those people as well. And the moment you start engaging with your object of research or the process or the people, you have become engaged, right? So we can say that there's this engaged view and there's this disengaged view. So if you follow, or if you like, or if you think it's more sympathetic with your research to follow the disengaged view, then you've got the positivistic paradigm that you fall in. On the other hand, if you are looking at the detached, engaged view, then you've got sort of the constructionist viewpoint that you adhere to, and that's the way that you will be conducting your research. Right? Now, Burrell and Morgan sort of framed this in the form of this diagram, and will slowly build up to this in more detail. But laterally, we've got on the one side positivism, and on the other side, we've got the constructionist viewpoint that exists, right? Now, on the top, we've got the detachment idea, and at the bottom, we've got the engaged view. So we've got four quadrants that sort of exist. Then we've got A, B, C, and D. And all the different paradigms that Burrell and Morgan talk about can be placed into either of these four quadrants. So as an example, we could be a positivist, purely a positivist that is completely disengaged from the processes and the people that are being researched. So in that case, in quadrant A, we can put positivism. Right? On the other side, we could be a constructionist and highly engaged. So we'll put that constructionist view or the phenomenological view in quadrant number C, right? So this is how it's going to progress. Now, in Burrell and Morgan's book, there's a number of different paradigms that have been spoken about at great length. So we'll be looking at these briefly, and then we'll be putting them against this map into the relevant quadrants that exist. Right? Later researchers or writers, such as your research onion guy, I forgot his name, Mark Saunders. He's taken the similar idea, but he's framed it in the shape of a research onion, right? So this Burrell and Morgan's work has been influential in the sense that it has later on shaped other researchers' perspectives and the way that they express this idea to us, right? So these are the paradigms mentioned in Burrell Morgan's book. First is critical realism, then we'll call critical theory, then we'll call feminism, hermeneutics, postmodernism, pragmatism, scientific method, structuration theory, and system theory. And since it's the 1979 edition of the book, later on, many more paradigms have also popped up. But once you understand the mapping of this, any new paradigm that you encounter can then be placed into the map that was shown to you just one slide ago. Right? Now, the first paradigm idea is this idea of detachment and this idea of positivism. So if we go and think about quadrant A, where we are positivists and we are detached from the processes and people that we are collecting information from, then what paradigms exist for us in that quadrant? So there's three paradigms that exist there. One is positivism, right? And I've talked to you about positivism before. The idea was that positivism is something that initially didn't exist. It started around the 1600s and it took full force in the scientific community. And it's laid down its foundations quite strongly to the extent that it lasted, or its influence lasted well into the 1930s. And even today, if you pick up researchers, you'll find that most of them follow the positivist viewpoint or the positivist paradigm. Right? Now, positivism has been influential in the sense because it has sort of dominated science as we know it in the recent history. And as I suggested to you at one time, there were 22 different types of positivism. And later on, Karl Popper, with his work on, led us to this idea of the hypothetical deductive or tradition. So now, when we talked about positivism, we're specifically talking about one particular type of positivism, and it's generally concerned about this idea of cause and effect, right? Either enumerating things in the sense of this statistics where we're concerned about how much something happens or how frequently it happens, or to find relationship amongst things, right? The second paradigm that we have in detached positivism is the idea of the scientific method, right? Now, the scientific method means that we follow some sort of a procedural way of conducting research inquiry. And in this, we can have different thoughts other than, for example, the survey or the experimental method. We can have, for example, action science as a part of the scientific method, which has a notion of studying an existing phenomena before a change, then studying that phenomena, coming up with a change, implementing that change, and then seeing how that phenomena changes or how the people change or the processes change, right? So in that case, we've got this systematic procedural way of conducting research, and normally this happens in a detached way. Right? So if you think about medical trials or drug trials, etc., those are very detached because we're not looking at how that person is feeling emotionally because of the interventions that are being exercised. Rather, our concern is more about the efficacy of the drugs and the cure value that they hold within. Right? Then we've got this other strange paradigm, which is called critical realism. And this comes to us from the work of Roy Ram Bhaskar, who was a professor of philosophy at Oxford University. And Bhaskar basically talked about this idea of causal mechanism. So in this paradigm, we're concerned about the cause and effect of things. It's sort of a version of positivism, but it's not really positivism. And it's sort of a version of constructionism, but it's not really constructionism. It's sort of a constructionist view that has a lineage towards the positivistic ideology, right? So we argue that critical realism is a qualitative way of doing research. Rather than looking at large sample sizes, it looks at smaller sample sizes, but is more concerned about looking at those sample sizes in greater detail, and also taking a very qualitative perspective. It looks at what people did and then what were the results that came out because of the actions those people took. So in a way, it helps us to identify the cause that led to a particular effect. Right? Now, it's a very strong paradigm in the sense that in positivism, we do see effects, but it's very difficult to identify the cause that led to that effect. But in critical realism, we've got this beauty where we not only see the effect, but we can also very clearly identify the cause that led to that effect. So what do I mean by this? As an example, we know that, research has shown to us that that smoking cigarettes can lead to cancer or to lung diseases. But research has so far struggled to identify what exactly in a cigarette is leading to cancer or leading to heart disease or lung disease. And then we find many people that continue to smoke for years and years and years, yet they never develop any cancer, yet they never develop any heart disease or lung disease, and they're perfectly fine. And then we find people that don't smoke at all, and sometimes they develop smoking related diseases because they're experiencing secondhand smoke per se. So what specifically in that cigarette is causing the particular effect? It turns out that there's more than 1,700 different types of chemicals and things in a cigarette. So it's very difficult for science to identify precisely what leads to that. But on the other hand, in critical realism, it's very easy because I'll say, I did this, and because of that, I found myself in a particular condition of nature X, right? So in that case, there's this undeniability, and there's this very clear connection of what led to that particular effect, right? So these are three methodologies that fall into this area of detached positivism. Then we've got detached constructionism. And in that, we've got hermeneutics, we've got postmodernism, and these are the two methodologies that fall into the detached constructionist quadrant. Hermeneutics was developed in the 1970s by the Protestants, Christian Protestants in Germany. And it was a way for them to interpret the Bible and to understand it in more closely. And with time, and with people working on hermeneutics, we find that, there's some people that have become the key proponents of this because these people started using this idea not in the domain of biblical study, rather they started using it in the domain of management sciences. And two people are quite influential in this, right? One is Gadamer in 1989, and the other is Ricoeur in 1981. And we'll talk about these two people and their contribution briefly. But what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is a way to look at textual information. And this textual information can be in the form of written words, in formal documents and informal documents. And it could also be spoken words that have later been transcribed by you. And then you can be looking at the way that things were spoken and the context in which they were spoken. Right? Now, Gadamer and Ricoeur are two seminal authors in the field of hermeneutics, and they take two different views of the way hermeneutics can be utilized. Gadamer is of the view that when we're exercising hermeneutics, we are concerned with the context of the text, right? So, for example, if we read some text and in it it is said that don't lose heart and don't despair. You must surely gain mastery if you're true in faith, right? So this is a particular translation of an ayat in the Quran. So if we follow Gadamer's hermeneutics, then we're concerned about the context of this text, right? When God is talking, who is God talking to? Is he talking to the general reader, or is that a statement issued in a particular context to certain people, right? So that would be Gadamer's hermeneutical view. Ricoeur, on the other hand, is focused on something else, and he says that there are temporal differences, right? So first, let's understand this idea of temporal. Temporal means that there's time differences, right? An author writes something and the reader may not be immediately reading what the author has written. So there's this detachment between the author and the reader, and Ricoeur calls this as distancing. So the concern here is what is the writer saying versus when is the reader sitting down to read that writing, and is there a temporal difference between the two that is causing perhaps a sort of confusion amongst what the writer intended to say and how the reader took it? Is that causing confusion in the way because when the author wrote it, the word meant one thing, but when the reader is reading it, it meant something different, right? So hermeneutics would be a form of detached constructionism. Then we've got another paradigm, which is called postmodernism. And postmodernism has its naissances in the French philosophy, and it's sort of become popular through the field of architecture. And what is postmodernism concerned about? It's concerned basically with modernity and how modernism has had an influence upon us and how it shapes our reality and our world. Right now, what is modernism basically? Modernism is basically then structures, and modernism is processes, and modernism is particular ways of thinking. So postmodernism says, well, once modernism comes, what effect does it have upon us, right? So modernism or postmodernism is it seeks to address basically the excesses of modernism, and it takes a stance against this regularity that we find around us, right? So what do we mean by this? If you were to venture out in the society where you live, you'll find that there's different forms and shapes of buildings that exist, and houses have a particular shape and format. So that is modernism, because many things look pretty much alike, and these gray structures and these same kind of colors or same type of patterns of houses that exist around us, they help us because it becomes easy for us to build that house, and it becomes acceptable because it doesn't look different than anybody else's house, and buyers are willing to buy it, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, this modernism hinders us because from a postmodernistic viewpoint, it has created this sense of regularity around us, and it inhibits development and growth, and it sort of limits us, right? So this is the idea behind postmodernism. So it is a critique of scientific progress, and it suggests that scientific progress is perhaps not really a good thing because it leads to further new problems. Right? For example, the development of vaccines and different types of medications such as antibiotics, etc., have increased our uh, life, right? The span of life, or the average age of a human male and female have extended because of the availability of vaccines and antibiotics, so to speak. But it has led to further problems such as osteoporosis, where people are not exposed to enough sunlight, and now when they reach an old age, the bones are brittle, and now they become incapacitated. Or because of the lifestyles that we have, people have more cancer in their bodies and so forth, and people are suffering and dying because of that. So, in a way, scientific progress has been good, but from a postmodernistic perspective, it has created new types of problems. So, in that way, postmodernists would believe that scientific progress is not really a good thing. The second viewpoint that the postmodernists have is that scientific progress is not a continuous process, so to speak. Rather, it's discontinuous. And we make some progress in not on a daily basis. Rather, we make some progress, and then we make no progress at all for many, many, many years. And then we make some progress. And when that progress does happen, it's not readily accepted, rather, it is contested. And that contestation leads to then discontent. And as a postmodernist, we would be concerned about the cycles of progress and the discontent that is created when these progresses are brought forward. Right? So that would be a detached constructionism type of a view. Now, on the third side, we've got engaged constructivism or constructionism, and in that we've got this paradigm called pragmatism. And pragmatism comes from the work of William James, who was a professor of philosophy and politics, etc., at Harvard University, and also John Dewey, and they're early 1900 writers, so around 1907 with James and 1916 with John Dewey, we get pragmatism coming to us, right? Pragmatism is a compromise between realism and relativism, and it looks at or it takes a completely different viewpoint. It says, well, you know, we cannot be something from the very beginning. For example, we cannot be positivists from the beginning, or we cannot be constructionists from the beginning. Rather, we have to look at particular research questions that we're posing based upon the phenomena that is of concern to us. And once we have written out our research questions, then we can determine which particular par paradigmatic viewpoint would work for us, right? So it's a very practical way of sort of looking at research. And it's a very refreshing viewpoint in the sense that it unloads the researcher from this burden of choosing a paradigmatic view from the start. Rather, it says, well, first pose your research questions, and then you can decide on which particular nature of philosophy or methodology that you would go for, right? The belief in pragmatism is that there's no predetermined theories or frameworks that shape knowledge or truth, nor does it accept that people can construct their own truths out of nothing. So we, as people, are involved, we are engaged, and we're relating to each other. And through that interrelations that we have with each other, we construct our consensual truth viewpoints. Right? And the key point of pragmatism is that any meaning structures must come then from the lived experience of the individuals. And as I suggested, it's a midpoint between realism and relativism. So it highly balances this abstract view of positivism with the reflective and observational view that we find in constructionism. Right? The second philosophy in engaged constructionism is that of critical theory. Right? Critical theory is a paradigm that came to us through the Frankfurt School and the people working through the Frankfurt School. And it is a paradigm that seeks to critique the effects of society and technology on human development. And the key proponent of critical theory is Jürgen Habermas, and his influential book is The Theory of Communicative Action, which is about 40 years of his work coming together, and it was published in the 1970s. And Habermas argues that society leads to inequality and alienation, yet it is invisible to people because they don't realize what effect the society and technology has upon us, and that leads to inequality and alienation. He therefore argues that there is a degree of irrationality in our actions, specifically us living in a capitalistic society. And this irrationality leads to false consciousness. And this false consciousness is related to the needs and wants that we have, right? So thus people are seduced through advertisements and through different types of compelling salesmanship to buy consumable goods, thinking that we need them, but rather we don't need these things, we only want them. So what is happening in this critical theory is this concern about this irrational behavior of the people, confusing their wants with their needs, and then buying things and engaging in consumerism and trying, they're desperately trying to gain happiness, right? So you'll be concerned if you take critical theory, then is to figure out where this invisibility is and how it affects us and how it gives rise to irrationality and false consciousness and to this consumeristic behavior that exists, right? Habermas also interestingly differentiates between natural and social sciences, and he believes that the natural sciences are based on sense-related experiences, whereas the social sciences should be concerned about communicative experiences. So the discourse that takes place between people um, could be then considered as either a relevant discourse or an irrelevant discourse. And the way that the discourse is considered to be relevant is when two entities have the same exact goal. But if the two entities have a different goal than each other, then we would consider that discourse to be irrelevant. Another philosophy or paradigm that exists here in the engaged constructionist viewpoint is that of feminism. Feminism is a viewpoint that considers the role of women in society and the role of women as researchers. So it's mostly concerned about providing a strong critique on the sciences on the ground that women's perspectives are highly ignored. And the belief in feminism, according to Blakey, is that women are ignored in five different respects. One is that there are few women in sciences, and we've seen different experiments related to this. And in one particular experiment, students in schools were asked to draw a scientist, and it was surprising to find that even the girls were drawing male characters as scientists. So that clearly has this mentality behind it, where people in society also perceive that there's a lack of women in the sciences, right? So there's fewer women in the sciences. There's a gender bias. Even the females are thinking that there are more male scientists in it. There's a gender bias in defining the research problems. We normally pose the problems or the research questions towards male respondents. There's a bias in the design of the research, and in that sense, we sort of hide the feministic perspectives, and we sort of either talk in abstract terms or we talk simply in neutral terms or from the male point of view. Fourthly, there's too many rigid dualisms in the male-dominated sciences. So it's this, the women will do this and the males will do such things, right? And science is not as rational and objective as it claims. So these are some of the stances of feminism. Structured interviews are things that are used in the sciences, and there's this view that even that creates status differences between the interviewer and respondent, even if the respondent or the interviewer is a woman. So you'll find that there's this huge disparity amongst them, and the males will tend to dominate, right? And external knowledge is impossible, and we must understand human behavior through the experiences of women as well as through the experiences of men. However, there is no emancipatory agenda in feminism. That is something that you'll find in radical feminism and not just in feminism as itself, right? Then we've got also here structuration theory, which was proposed by Giddens in 1984, and it developed the idea of duality of structure. And it says that structure and agency should not be regarded as preordained, right? Structures and agency is something that doesn't just come to us. Rather, Giddens suggests that structures are created and they're recreated through social actions of the individuals there, and these creations and recreations of these structures then guides or constrains the agency that we can have, right? This liberty or what we possibly can do. So hence there's this continuous interaction then between structures and social actions, if you take structuration as your paradigm. And laws of nature and social sciences are perceived differently here. Laws of nature are considered to be universal, whereas the laws of social sciences are considered to be contextually developed. And so some thing that we find in social sciences in one context will only apply to that context. We cannot generalize it to the overall, right? The use of language is problematic in the sense that structuration theory says that there's this dependence amongst the researchers to use highly specialized language, and that sort of alienates other people who read the work that is being produced by the social scientists. So, the meanings that we have for the words may not be construed in the same way as somebody who does not belong to that particular domain set. So the recommendation is that we use common language rather than precise or domain specific language, which leads to obscurity and confusion, right? So the preference is to use common language when you're describing things. Then lastly, we've got engaged positivism, and in this area, we've got systems theory. And systems theory got developed in the 1950s, and it's an interdisciplinary methodology that seeks to bring together systems theory from the perspective of both the living systems and also the inanimate systems. And it borrows and steals ideas from both these domains, and you can apply it both on human beings, or you could also think about inanimate systems. There are some basic assumptions of systems theory. One is that complex systems need to be studied as a whole. We should not be breaking down a system into its pieces because it doesn't help us. What do we mean by this? Well, we mean, for example, that if we take a human being and we dissect the human, and we take out their pieces, and we'll find that a particular male human being is composed of a brain, of a spinal cord, of a reproductive system, a digestive system, of an endocrine system, of a respiratory system, and so on and so forth. And we can understand all these systems in their individual selves, right? For example, we can understand the venous system, and we can understand the arterial system, and we can understand the digestive system in isolation, and we can understand it perfectly. But if we put all these systems back together, can we understand how that human being is going to behave? So that idea is there in systems thinking, that, well, you could strive to understand the pieces that comprise the overall system, but you will never understand the overall system as a whole. So rather than wasting your energy, so to speak, to decompose the system and understand its small pieces, you shouldn't do it. Rather, you should concentrate on simply understanding that complex system as a whole. Don't worry about decomposing it and understanding its small components, right? It doesn't help. The second assumption is the relationship of the actors is where most of the relevant information is going to exist. So if you're looking at human systems, look at then the relationships that exist amongst the people, and the discourse that takes place when people are relating to each other and talking to each other. That's where most of the information is going to be existing. And thirdly, that systems have certain common properties. Whether they're animate or inanimate systems, they have certain common properties, such as certain systems are open systems, certain systems are closed systems, or fractals, or bifurcations, or period doubling, and such type of dissipations, etc. So there are certain common characteristics that we'll find both in inanimate systems and also in animate systems or living systems. Now, within systems theory, we've got two ways of going about doing systems theory. One is the soft systems methodology, also known as SSM, and this was proposed by Peter Checkland in the 1970s, and it focuses on complex, problematic human situations and the purposeful actions that these humans take in that problematic situation, right? So in order to do soft systems methodology, you must have one, a complex problematic situation, and number two, you must have humans that are taking purposeful actions in that complex problematic situation they are concerned about, capturing those purposeful actions and understanding the human situation in that context. Right? And the other way of doing systems theory is to do the critical systems theory, which is basically an extension of the soft systems methodology, and it introduces elements of critical theory into the picture. So as soon as critical theory comes into the picture, we become concerned about critical social awareness, accepting pluralism in organizations, and then also having a concern for emancipation. So just like where Habermas was talking about how these systems affect us and they limit us and the discourses that we have. So if we are doing systems theory using the critical systems theory, so we're borrowing elements of critical theory and we're combining them with these complex problematic human situations and purposeful actions that people are taking in those situations. So this leads us then finally to this fully developed diagram of Burrell and Morgan, where we still have positivism and social constructionism on the lateral axis here, and on the vertical axis, we've got the detached and engaged, and the quadrants have now been filled out with the different paradigms that we have available. So I hope that gives you a little bit more understanding upon the different paradigms that you could have for your research, and this would enable you to either select from these paradigms and use in your own research study, or to examine other new paradigms that have been developed and place them on this map, and then examine your role and your concern point for regarding the data that you'll collect and the type of questions that you can ask, right? So thank you so very much. I'll end this lecture here.